Welcome to Objection to the Form. This is Justin Humphreys. This week I've got a special guest, Allen Trask. Hello, Allen.
Hey, Justin. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to have you here for two things. First of all, maybe a little known fact about Allen, but Allen throws the best Christmas parties in the game. I would say the best New Hanover County Christmas party ever was the one where Allen was in charge. So I'm glad to have you here.
Once upon a time.
But the second thing is, you're really pioneering a new area of the law, and I think it's one that interests a lot of people. And I have a lot of admiration for you because sometimes we kind of learn what we learn in law school and stick with it. Maybe we keep up with changes in cases or statutes, but this is kind of a new field that's emerging before our eyes. So it's exciting for me to learn about what you've got to say, about a topic that a lot of people want to know about.
Sure. Well, excited to be here and glad to share kind of our experiences to this point. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my partner, Tyler Russell, though. He and I work so closely together, and we kind of found ourselves running this venture side by side. He's a business attorney up in Raleigh and co-chairs the group with me at the firm.
So the group, is it hemp law or is it agribusiness, or what do you consider what you're doing?
So that's a great question, and I think a little bit of background about how we got here will sort of answer it. So our firm's an Eastern North Carolina firm, originally based in New Bern and then Greenville, Wilmington, and expanded to Asheville and Raleigh. But with that Eastern North Carolina heritage, we've always found ourselves doing a lot of agribusiness work. And several years ago, we organized the attorneys that found themselves doing that work into a practice group, the agribusiness practice group. And I've been coordinating that group for a few years now. And out of that group, we had several attorneys that were that started to get calls about hemp when it came into the market. And so we picked up that work, started doing it. Over time, that work took on a life of its own. And in June of 2019, we actually formed an independent practice group, the Hemp Law Practice Group.
When do you start getting calls coming in about hemp?
So we really started to see the calls in a meaningful way in the 2016-2017 time frame, and then picked up steam from there.
Because I know there was a point in time, I believe, where hemp itself was illegal.
That's right. And so there's really nothing else in the world like hemp and how it's treated. Hemp is a selectively bred version of the cannabis plant, and specifically the cannabis sativa plant. Another version of that plant is marijuana. Hemp is decriminalized, marijuana is not at a federal level. Certainly there's some states that have a different approach than the feds. In 1970, you have the Controlled Substances Act that defined the cannabis plant as marijuana and scheduled it on Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive schedule. It was effectively criminalized, all versions of the plant. In 2014, the federal government passed the 2014 Farm Bill, which allowed states to develop research programs that would enable their farmers in that particular state to grow hemp. And hemp was defined in that act as the cannabis sativa plant with less than a certain amount of THC. It's 0.3%, so 30% of a percent. And the reason THC is so important is because that's a psychoactive ingredient in marijuana.
How do you control that? Is it a certain... Is it through kind of research and development, or do you just grow it and test it and separate, or how do you know whether the plants are going to be within each threshold?
Sure, yeah, that's a big issue is testing the plants, and they're different methods, but suffice it to say that the plants can be harvested and then tested at facilities to determine what the THC level is and to determine if they're compliant. Now, the research programs were administered at a state level. So you had a North Carolina program, for instance, you had a Kentucky program, there were a Colorado program, there were different programs. Now things have evolved a little bit more, and there was a subsequent Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, that actually federally decriminalized hemp. And so at that point, now we have much more federal involvement than we had prior to 2018.
And so is it a statewide standard, or are you operating off of federal regulations, or kind of a combination of the two?
Sure. So the federal law, everything trickles down from the federal law. So at the current time, the 2018 Farm Bill is the law that trickles down to all the states and kind of informs what the limits are. And we're still at that 0.3%.
And you're talking about the THC limits?
That's right.
And does the way it work, or can states vary from that, or is that a nationwide?
It's a federal floor, and so or a federal standard, excuse me. So you cannot exceed that standard. And yes, how that's controlled. I mean, there is a genetics level control of it. There are lots of geneticists and scientists out there that are selectively breeding the cannabis plant to meet those thresholds, and those are sold as hemp varietals.
How does that impact what you see in the stores? Because I think you see a lot of, I know we're not a legalized state here, but you can purchase things like CBD.
Right.
And so what exactly is CBD?
So CBD, cannabidiol, is a cannabinoid just like THC. There are over 100 cannabinoids. These are just chemical components of the plant. The interesting thing about CBD is it is not psychoactive like THC, so it doesn't give you the quote-unquote high, but it does have other properties that have proven to be desirable in the market. Things like being, folks have claimed that it is anti-inflammatory, and that it helps with pain. These are all anecdotes. I would note these are not things that have been federally approved. There's only one federally approved drug right now that is where CBD is the active ingredient.
Do you see with CBD, there's various terms, like I've heard full spectrum.
Right.
So does that mean, I've heard with some of them, if you have drug tests that you're taking, you want to avoid certain types of CBD. Right. And I believe I've heard those referred to as full spectrum.
Right.
Is full spectrum, does that mean it's above that floor or that ceiling of the 3%, or is that just meaning that there is some THC in it?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because that's one of the sort of the drug testing issue is a hot button issue out there right now. So the really interesting thing about THC is that it is illegal in certain contexts and legal in other contexts. And so in the marijuana plant, THC is illegal. You are allowed to have that sort of negligible amount of THC in the hemp plant. And full spectrum does contain the legal limit of THC. But the thing about THC is that it doesn't metabolize in our systems the same way like alcohol does. So alcohol runs out of your system at a fairly accelerated rate. I want to say that it's like a drink an hour or something like that. THC is not like that. So if you take these full spectrum products, you do run the risk that the THC can stack up and potentially trigger a positive drug test.
Will it appear the same way on your drug test as if you've been smoking a lot of weed, or will it show? Or I'm serious. Like,
yeah, no.
I mean, does it read the same, or is it like, or does it show? Is it just THC is what the test is revealing?
So most of the tests that are out there only reveal a positive or negative for THC. They don't tell you this person has consumed X amount of product in a certain amount of time. And that's really the problem, is that employers, from the employer side, they're looking at this and saying, well, how do we know? There's no way to know. And from the employee side, they're saying, I went to a store and bought this product. I'm not doing anything illegal. And so to add a layer to that, in North Carolina, we have a law, the Lawful Use of Lawful Products Act,
yep,
which I think you're familiar with, and which says that you cannot be penalized for, using a legal product on your own time, unless it interferes with your job duties.
Yeah, and I think,
and unless the employer has a policy that defines that.
And I could be mistaken about this, but I think one of the purposes of those laws were there was a time where before the Affordable Care Act, where people were being fired for being smokers because of the effect on insurance premiums, and I think that was part of it. But that's an interesting point that you raised that, because if you're going to terminate somebody for a positive test for taking a lawful substance, I could see where that would be problematic for the employers.
Yeah, I would say to employers who are faced with that situation, proceed with caution, and it makes sense. If you have any concerns about it as an employer, to talk to your representation about the policies that address the issues in the Lawful Use of Lawful Products Act.
So around the 2018 period, when you start getting calls about hemp, what are first of all, what type of calls are you getting, and what is it that they're looking for you to do?
So there's several different kinds of businesses that are involved in the hemp sort of economic chain. You have the growers, the actual farmers that are growing it, either in open air farms or in greenhouses. You've got the extractors who take the harvested hemp and then extract the useful chemicals out of it. And then you have manufacturers who take the intermediate products and put them into a consumable. And then you have the retailers who sell that to the consumers. And so we have gotten calls across that whole chain. I would say that in the beginning, the majority of our calls were either from growers who wanted to participate in the North Carolina hemp pilot program, or they were from extractors that were actually producing the CBD oil.
Are you seeing much of a shift of tobacco farmers either replacing their crops with hemp or kind of doing a blend of the two?
So it's certainly not a situation where people are completely abandoning tobacco to go into hemp, especially now as the commodity price has fallen a little bit. But the majority of the grower interest that came our way was from tobacco farmers that were looking for a way to diversify their crop.
So as I understand what you're saying, it's kind of a lot of the definitions of these plants seem to concentrate around the THC percentage, or that seems to be the driving factor.
That's right.
So if you're
a distinguishing characteristic.
If you're a farmer, do you face any liability if your plants happen to be at 0.05 or 0.5% instead of the 3% threshold, or how are you held accountable for that, or is there a kind of a good faith variance where as long as you're not growing for potency, or that you might not be in control of it?
So the North Carolina pilot program is the enforcement wing of that is the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and if a crop tests hot, then they are going to work with you to deal with those results. But to fast forward to the end, if you have a hot crop that is over the 0.3% limit, it's going to be destroyed.
And who are you? Is it self-testing for the farmers, or does the agriculture? Would you say it's the North Carolina Department of Agriculture?
That's right.
So
they handle the testing, and there is a one licensed facility in North Carolina. It's Avazyme, up in the Triangle, that handles that testing for the DOA.
So every plant throughout the state has to go through that facility? Not
every plant. They have a sort of a sample size testing method. And so they're not going to come out and sample every single plant that you have, but what they are going to do is take a representative sample, and they also take into consideration the test results you've had in the past.
And so, what you kind of mentioned the hot crop, and then they come in and destroy everything. Yep. Is there any other penalties available, or is that just kind of based upon your history?
There are not. Now, I would be quick to distinguish bad actors from good actors, and the overwhelming amount of folks that we see are good actors in the this is not something that's used as a pretext to grow marijuana, and the reason is the margin. So an acceptable level of THC is 30% of a percent or less. I mean, that is minuscule. You have marijuana varieties out west that are in the 10% and up THC range. And so there's no advantage to you as a farmer to grow a hemp crop at 0.06, say. And there's no, you're not getting anything by doing that on the, the illegal market. So the DOA has a good relationship with its farmers and works with these folks. Unfortunately, it does happen. It particularly happens, and I mean crops being hot, testing hot, when new varietals are being tested in North Carolina. So say you receive a variety, you're a grower, you're licensed, you receive a varietal from Colorado that grows in that climate and that soil a certain way. It's dry, at rocky soil. You bring that to North Carolina, wet soil, just a completely different environment, and we have seen those varietals test differently in both states.
What's the process like if you decide that you want to get into hemp farming?
Sure. So currently, and this is set to change next year, but currently the North Carolina has a hemp commission that monitors the pilot program and sort of administers it. And there's an application that you fill out. The most notable hurdle to becoming licensed to grow hemp is that you have to have legitimate farming income from the prior tax year, and you show that on you show evidence of that with your tax return. So every Joe off the street is not going to be able to get a hemp growing license. They're really trying to restrict that to legitimate farmers.
I see. And so you just have to have, and you say, is it revenue or profit as a farmer?
Just revenue.
Well, so you were mentioned that the North Carolina Agricultural, is it commission or department or what?
Yeah, so you've got the North Carolina Department of Agriculture that actually handles the sort of enforcement and works hand in hand with the North Carolina Hemp Commission. And they both sort of together run the North Carolina pilot program, which is the research program that we talked about earlier.
And how does that program relate to, I know you mentioned the 2018 Farm Act, which is kind of, I guess that's where, I guess that's the body of law that kind of establishes everything.
Right. That's right.
What's the relationship between those two bodies and the federal law?
So it's really interesting, and it's kind of a mess. Like we talked about earlier, the 2014 Farm Bill provided a structure whereby states could create research programs for their farmers to grow hemp. And technically, at that point, hemp was still federally criminal. And this was an exception to that. So this did not change the status of the 1970 Controlled Substances Act, but rather provided a limited exception that states could administer. That all changed on December 20 of 2018. That's when the federal government adopted the 2018 Farm Bill, and that actually federally decriminalized hemp. It authorized the USDA to develop a national domestic hemp production program. It descheduled and removed hemp as defined as the cannabis plant with less than a certain amount of THC from the Controlled Substances Act altogether, and also authorized federal banking. So you just kind of have a different treatment. One is more of an exception to the rule, and the other is changing the rule itself. So currently, the federal government's agencies have not quite caught up with the law itself. And so the USDA has issued an interim final rule creating the domestic hemp production program. So there's a framework out there. The DEA has issued an interim final rule with how it is going to treat hemp. Both of those are interim rules. And while they're still interim rules, the government is allowing the research programs that were under the 2014 Farm Bill to continue.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is when the final rules are established, will that be a result of Congress, or will that be more of an administrative act?
So it's the way these interim final rules kind of work is that they have a period after they're adopted by the agency. And I'll tell you, I'm no federal regulatory attorney, but they have a period of time that they are in an interim stage. There's a comment period, and my understanding is that it's a time for them to test out the structure. And after a certain point, it becomes a final rule. And so the USDA's final rule on the domestic hemp production program will provide the regulatory floor for how states are to handle it. But the interesting thing about hemp is that states can opt into primary regulatory authority for hemp as long as they're above that floor. And so they actually will apply to the USDA, submit their state program to the USDA for approval.
Has North Carolina gone through that process yet?
Not yet. We anticipate that at some point North Carolina will, but it has not gone through that process yet. There are some other states that are in the midst of that process.
What kind of, I guess when I think of hemp, I'm thinking like you'd see rope or necklaces
Sure.
or things like that. What are the clients that you're working with? What type of products are they creating with hemp?
So the majority of what we're seeing in the market right now is hemp that is destined to be extracted into CBD. That just tends to be what people are doing with the market right now. What you mentioned is fiber hemp, and they actually look like two different plants. Hemp grown for CBD is bushier and has larger floral parts. Hemp grown for fiber looks like bamboo. It's real tall, got kind of a little tuft on top, and they're harvested in two different ways. They're sort of treated in two different ways. Fiber hemp has generated a ton of interest because it's a neat product that addresses a lot of the issues that are out there. It's actually, from what I understand, very good for your land and a sustainable thing versus some other crops. And so there's a lot of interest in it. The infrastructure is not quite there to take advantage of that just yet. Then there are other countries that are a little bit ahead of the game in terms of growing fiber hemp, Canada, China, some others.
Gotcha. So the majority of what's going on then, I guess, is for CBD?
At the time, at the current time. But I would note that in addition to CBD, there are lots of other cannabinoids out there that are of interest, and there research all the time being done on those. And so while CBD is like the thing of today, I think some of those other cannabinoids are going to come into the market pretty soon.
Is CBD the only one that's legal of those, or is it just people that it's just kind of a lot of the other, how do you pronounce it?
Cannabinoid.
Cannabinoids. So
Yeah.
the other cannabinoids, are they just, or they're legal, but they're not really, hadn't been studied enough to get into the market yet?
Well, I think the way to think about it is that THC is the one that's illegal, and the rest are considered to be
Like a byproduct, maybe?
almost like a byproduct. Now, I'd say there was a time where we didn't know what CBD did, and we figured that out, and we're able to sort of isolate it, and now it's found its way into federally approved drugs, or one federally approved drug. It's called Epidiolex. But the other cannabinoids, there's one called CBG, CBN. There are others that are being studied to see what it is that they do.
Are you dealing with many clients in the CBD, I guess, distribution end?
Yeah, we sure are. And so I think there's there's distribution between each link of the chain. There are more and more logistics companies coming in, especially now that we have a little bit more of a national market for this. But we certainly work with manufacturers and retailers that are getting products to market.
Now, are those regulatory bodies the ones that deal with CBD for consumption? The one I forgot, and the two state level commissions that you were talking about, or is there a separate like the ABC board or ATF or something along those lines?
So we're not quite there yet at a state level, but in terms of retailing products and consumer protection, we're really talking about three things: the Federal Trade Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, and at the state level, it is the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, and I think it's Division of Consumer Protection.
So
I believe I've got that right.
I know you're mentioning that that I guess the state grants licenses to hemp farmers. Where do you go to get licensed to manufacture CBD?
So the interesting thing is, as it stands today, and this is a little bit of the regulatory morass that's out there, the only license that is out there, period, is, at least in North Carolina, is for growing hemp. There's no license to extract it. There's no license to retail it. There's no license to to distribute it or anything like that. So really the only thing that's being specifically regulated from a licensure standpoint is growing it. Now there is a registry of processors where you need to tell the state, hey, I'm extracting hemp, here's where I'm doing it, here's the name, that it's under, that sort of thing.
Where do the farmers go about selling their products?
So the way you really kind of have two different products. One is smokable hemp, that is really just dried flower straight from the plant. And there are farmers who are selling that themselves and then also selling that to retailers, like brick and mortar establishments or online. And then you have extracted products, sort of like the little tincture bottles that you see or other sort of consumable products. And in those situations, those products are being made from an extract. So your farmer is selling to their material to the extractor.
What's the point of smoking hemp? Like, is it kind of like cigarettes? Is that sort of what it's like, or is it just?
So really, all we're talking about is a method for delivery of CBD. CBD is the ingredient that people want to consume. So smoking hemp, I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's not a substitute for marijuana or anything like that. It is just a different delivery mechanism, and whether you smoke it or whether you ingest it through a more extracted consumable, they're both just delivery systems for CBD.
Gotcha.
And I'd say that there are folks that that prefer kind of the right off the plant type of thing versus the more industrial process.
And so I guess this is different. Like I think about there was a time a few years ago where you had the synthetic marijuana in the gas stations, and so this is different from that.
It is, and frankly, you don't see smokable hemp, and it's not as mainstream as some of the other more refined products.
So it's interesting that the level of regulation isn't quite there yet with the extracted products, because I was thinking, like, one of the concerns I think some people have is you really don't know what you're getting in some situations.
Yeah, and it's a real concern. And there's been quite a lot of pressure on both state and federal regulators to get these regulations to a point where folks feel safe about what they're ingesting. And there have been numerous letters sent by the FDA, the FTC, state level, scolding folks, putting them on notice that they are marketing these products in an improper way. And so the FDA and the FTC and the states kind of fall in line with that. They have been clear that you cannot say that your product has a medical benefit. You can't, you've got to be honest about those sorts of things, because at this point, this is not a product that is treated by the FDA as generally regarded as safe. It's an unregulated product, and now, but what they will do is make sure that people are not misleading consumers.
Are you involved in any lobbying efforts to try to kind of figure out what the law is going to be or how these things should be handled?
Yeah, we certainly are. And I mentioned my partner Tyler Russell earlier. Tyler actually was the North Carolina lobbyist for the U.S. Hemp Roundtable, which is sort of a national organization that looks out for the interest of the participants in the industry. And he was, just engrossed in that effort for a while at the state level. And unfortunately, those laws never came to pass, but there's at least a structure that a lot of people have worked very hard to put out there.
What are the objectives that people like your partner and others are trying to see accomplished?
So I think all of us in the industry would like to see a structure that not only enables folks to participate in the market, but also protects the consumers. And it's better for everybody. This regulatory uncertainty everybody understands that there's a time where that will exist in any sort of new evolution of the law. But we're 2 years in, and I think a lot of us in the industry are ready for this thing to, from a regulatory standpoint, to get more certain, because certainty helps everybody. Yep. It helps you know what the rules of the game are, provides the consumers with the protection that they need and deserve, and just kind of makes everything. I don't know. It's just a better result.
Do you find that you're running into situations where there's like the rumor mill where people feel uncomfortable taking certain actions or making certain investments because they have concerns that the rug might get jerked out from under them at a certain point?
Yeah, it's really interesting. You find all kinds of results because the regulatory uncertainty keeps some investment money out, and it brings some investment money in. There are some people that like to gamble on the fact that there's regulatory uncertainty, and so we have not seen banks come in with commercial lending like you would see in a more mature industry with more regulatory certainty. Most of the money has been private, and they're just wild divergence of folks that, as to their approach to a market like this.
Are you involved with any of the private equity funding with some of these clients?
We are.
And I'm sure there's many different ways to do it, but what do you think is an advantageous way to get your product funded if you're a farmer that's interested in getting into this market?
So let's say you have invented a consumable that you need some money to get behind, or you want to start an extraction facility and you want some money to get behind you. Having a really good understanding of what the market is, what the prices are, what the regulatory climate is out there, and what the possibilities of the regulatory picture, how it may clarify and ultimately look, and being prepared for those different outcomes. Those are things that your investors are going to want to know.
Is there much of a pushback or a political opposition to hemp right now?
Hard to answer. I think that there's certainly a tremendous amount of support behind the industry, especially in North Carolina, because North Carolina was one of the first states to get out and to actually adopt a pilot program, get some infrastructure started, and it's been good for North Carolina. We're a state that has an $80+ billion agribusiness economy. I mean, it's by far and away the most important economy vertical, if you will, in North Carolina. And so it made sense that North Carolina would want to get involved in that. There's confusion out there and some resistance about the fact that hemp and marijuana look the same. They smell the same. Just spot checking, it's difficult to tell the difference. You got to test them to figure out the difference in many cases, and that has led to some confusion. But we're confident, as participants in the market, we're confident all that's going to get worked out. There are lots of creative ways to handle that sort of interesting situation.
What evolutions in regulation and just hemp law in general do you see coming down in the future?
So I would hope certainly that the FDA and the FDA would sort of lead the charge on handling the consumer protection piece, give the industry some guidance on several different things. Right now you cannot use CBD as an ingredient in a food or a drink product, even though you can buy the tincture and add it yourself as a consumer. Someone can't do that for you. They can't adulterate that product for you. What's the role of CBD in cosmetics, things like that? It would just be nice to have the FDA sort of address those issues, or to have Congress address it legislatively. I mean, there are two different ways that can get done. Be nice to have more guidance on the intellectual property side of the house. The banking side of the house has a long way to go. The way the DEA treats things, all of that needs a significantly more attention than it's gotten to this point.
And so with the intellectual property end of it, do you have the various strands? Are they patented? Is it protected by trade secret law?
So the various strains of the plant?
Yes.
So there is an act, the Plant Variety Protection Act, that's available to protect a plant variety, similar to just your regular intellectual property protection. To my knowledge, no one has, at least in North Carolina, I don't believe has pursued that protection for a hemp varietal. But it'd be interesting to see how that kind of comes to bear, because as this is more and more prevalent in markets across the country, I do think you're going to have more and more opportunities for things like that. There are some interesting time limits on the PVPA, but.
And what do you see as the biggest obstacles right now for the people aspiring to be in the hemp business, or the people that are currently in it?
Sure. Well, for the folks that are aspiring to be in it, it's finding your niche, because there are a lot of people in the market already. There's both national pressure on the market, and then there's the state level pressure on the market. For folks that are already in the business, banking continues to be a concern. Not having reliable access to banking, although several banks around the country are getting with the program, so to speak. Not having access to traditional lending is a problem, just from having just an operating line, and the regulatory uncertainty with the FDA and the DEA just continues to be a problem.
Gotcha. Well, Allen, I appreciate you coming on, and there's a lot of
thank you so
interesting
much for having
information. Is there anything you think of that we hadn't touched on here that the people should know? There's
an absolute ton that we have not touched on, because this is one complicated topic, but I really do appreciate you giving me a few minutes to come on and to talk about something that we're really enjoying doing.
Well, thanks a lot.